Hello and welcome to our November Tuesdays with lecture, our lecture series sponsored by the Friends of the Georgetown Library. We're very happy to have you with us today and know you'll enjoy our special lecture that we'll be having together. This is a series that we have been having now for 4 years, a wonderful series of lectures from individuals from throughout the Georgetown community sharing with us concerning history and nature and other interest subjects to us as we are excited about what we are doing here in Georgetown. Tuesdays With is a title of, or comes from a title of a book by Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Morrie, a best-selling book in 1997. And we've used that title because it expresses that ongoing learning experience that we all have far beyond our formal training back in high school and college and university that go on through the rest of our lives. And that's our purpose, to provide ongoing, lifelong learning experiences. Tuesdays With. I want to thank Heather Pelham and Truman Wynn, who are our technology people behind the scenes today. That has been a great assistance to us as we have looked at creative ways to continue our programs, our schedule of the Friends of the Georgetown Library, and they've been a tremendous assistance to us with this lecture series, as well as other opportunities that we are providing. Today, Tuesdays With is Tuesday with William Connor. William is Professor of Forestry and Environmental Conservation Department, the Baruch Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science, right here in Georgetown. So we're really thrilled to have William, an outstanding lecturer and good friend. He has an undergraduate degree from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. His master's degree is in marine science from Louisiana State University, and his doctorate from Louisiana State University as well in forestry. Some of his research interests, as he comes to share with us today, is fresh and saltwater forested wetlands, wetlands management, the effects of humans and nature on natural environments, estuarine and upland connections, and historical ecology. I like to brag on my friend. He received the Clemson University Board of Trustees 2000 Award for Faculty Excellence. He received the Clemson University highest agricultural honor, the Goodley Snell Award for Excellence in Agricultural Research in 2010. And he's authored or edited 3 books, 1 special issue of Wetland Ecology and Management, 32 book chapters, 93 refereed journal papers, and 80 other scientific papers and reports, and he's got a little bit of time to share with us today in all the busyness of his activities and research. So today, William will be speaking on the bald cypress, the wood eternal, eternal question mark, and the tree eternal question mark. We welcome William Connor as our speaker today, and want to mention as well that if you have questions for William as he speaks, that you can put those in the comment section there on Facebook. And in that way, we'll be able to have those questions for him when he completes his presentation. Again, we welcome William Connor.
Thank you, Bob, and I'm glad to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to you about something that I am very passionate about and have been studying for the last almost 48 years, bald cypress. And if you're looking at the title, I'm sure you've wondered about the exact title, the wood eternal period, tree eternal question mark. And that refers to the wood eternal, to the durability of the old ancient cypress when it was logged. It was very rot resistant, insect resistant. It seemed to last forever, so it got that name, wood eternal, early on. And then the tree eternal with the question mark is in reference to what we've been studying for the last several decades, looking at the forest and what's going on out there, what's happening to the forest, what's happening to the tree itself, and will the tree be there for our future generations? So with that, we're going to proceed, and I'll try not to talk too fast or to wave my hands too much or scratch my head like my wife tells me to keep my hands away from my head. But one nice thing about being virtual like this is you can't see my knees shake. So what we always tell our students to do when they're making a presentation is give an outline to tell people what you're going to talk about. I made mine simple. we're going to talk about the past, we're going to talk about the present, and we're going to talk about the future of this species. So with that, we'll move on to the first slide there. We know that the species taxodium has been around for a long time. If you look up in the upper, I guess it's your upper left of the screen there, there's a fossil of a taxodium tree from approximately 60 million years ago from swamps in Montana, which we don't usually think of swamps being in Montana. In the lower right there, you have another fossil of a taxodium species found in Germany, estimated to be 8 million years old. So cypress have been around for a long time in the swamps of the early dinosaurs, and it also, a lot of that organic matter that was produced by these swamps later came to be what we have today as our fossil fuel source, oil. So these swamps were very important even way back then. And an example of looking closer to home, in 2012, after Hurricane Ivan, in the upper slide there, you can see some old buried cypress forests that were exposed by Ivan, churning up the ocean floor and exposing this, what has now become a fish reef of cypress trees. In the lower two slides, you can see examples of a fossil cypress trees that were discovered in Hungary in 2007 in an open coal pit. And the thing to remember about these is they're not petrified trees. They are fossilized wood that's still there, that was preserved by the environment that it's in, so that now that you can go in and harvest these trees and actually collect them and have wood to be used for different projects. Even closer to home, here in Conway, in the sand pits along the PD River and up in Johnsonville, about 10 years ago, they were excavating sand from the pits. They were bringing up these chunks of wood and just burning them because they were useless. They didn't need them for their sand trucks to haul away. But somebody from Clemson stopped by and asked if they could have a piece of the wood. They took it, had it carbon dated, and turned out it was about 40,000 years old. So they created what they call their Ancient Cypress Consortium, made a deal with the sand companies that they could pull out the logs, and if you look on the upper right to the specimen that's leaning up there, you can actually see some of the attached cypress knees still on the tree. And some of the trees actually had vines still wound around them. So they take the logs, they bring them up, let them dry, get all the water out of them, then they can mill them and process them. And they were selling the wood for up to $100 a board foot. And if you've ever worked with wood, you realize that $100 a board foot is a lot of money. But a lot of craftsmen were using the wood for different projects. We had a canoe that was built out of the wood that was shown at one of the boat shows here in Georgetown years ago. If you see the governor of South Carolina talking, look at the podium and you might see a little wooden seal on the front of the podium. It was made from the cypress wood that was donated to the governor. So, you know, we've had trees going all the way from the dinosaur age, starting to discover these old cypress logs that are down underneath the sands there. So it's been around for a long time. And when Europeans first arrived in the United States, and they began wondering, you know, just what existed in the country. You know, some of our old adventurers like William Bartram and James Audubon and others that were going out wandering through the wilds of North America. And William Bartram in the 1700s, his publication that travels through the Carolinas in 1791, got highlighted on the screen there several statements about the bald cypress, talking about the stateliness of the trunks, the prodigious buttresses. And if you've ever been out in the swamps, you've seen these big swollen bases on the bottom of the trees. The woody cones or the cypress knees, which have been a fascination to people ever since they've noticed them out there as to what they're for. And I'll try to get back to that somewhere along in the talk here. The grand straight columns 80 or 90 feet high with the flat tops and the eagle nest and the trees and the stately Spanish moss waving in the breeze. So, it created and painted quite a picturesque picture of these swamps out there. And one of the things that they did also notice when they were out in the swamp, which has had a huge impact on the future of our cypress swamps, is these Carolina parakeets. Carolina parakeets were very numerous in the early days of exploration in the southeast. In 1791, Bartram wrote in his book, you see the parakeets fluttering in the treetops of the cypress trees, and you notice even that they were, the painting that he did, the parakeet is pictured here with a cypress tree and the bird feeding on the cypress cones. And John James Audubon, in his painting of the Carolina parakeets over on the right-hand side of the picture there, one of the things that Audubon did when he was collecting specimens for his paintings was he would dissect the birds and looking at different features of the birds. And one of the things he would like to do was to cut open the stomachs, and he commented in his journals of their crops being filled with cypress seeds. So the Carolina parakeets at that point in time, and probably during their whole history, was a bird feeding on cypress seeds, helping to transport the seed from area to area. The last known parakeet killed in the wild was 1904. The last one in captivity died in 1918, and in 1939 it was officially declared extinct. So the one and only bird that we had that carried the seed from place to place no longer exists, which has a huge impact on exactly how you're going to get seed from one place to another in the future. And we'll talk about that a little bit further too as we go. But one of the things that most people realized, because they had lots of swamps, most of the people that were living along the rivers, which was the main means of transportation back in those days, and the plantations and the houses and towns backed up to these swamp systems. And the views that most people had of them were not very good. This is an 1860 woodcut from Harper's Weekly, showing it to be a dark, dismal place, lots of alligators, snakes, snapping turtles. Not a place that you would really want to go into, and most people were considered a fool if they did go into these areas. And the foul odors that were emanating from the swamps they thought caused malaria and diseases. So most people didn't think very much of swamps back in those days. But one of the things that did happen was that even from the early Indians, they learned about the durability of the wood. They learned about how rot resistant it was, and they started to lumber the cypress trees and use it as a cash crop. And up until the 1790s or so, it was probably the main cash crop for colonists in Louisiana. But it was a difficult species to harvest. You had to go out into these swamps, mainly if you look in the lower left there, with the people walking into the swamps with their axes and their crosscut saws. They would cut the timber. They would stay out there for months at a time, felling the trees and trying to float it out in the springtime with the high waters and float it down to the mills. Like in the bottom center there, the Atlantic Coast Lumber Company, the largest mill in the east of the Mississippi in its time, and it's located right here in Georgetown. But in the 1890s, they began to get a little bit more industrious in these swamp areas. In the upper right area, there's a couple of slides, one showing a steam engine and how they would run a cable out into the swamps about 5,000 feet, and they could cut the timber and drag it along up into a collection point that again could be either floated out or hauled out, and one of the ways they hauled it out was by train. The upper right there, built thousands of miles of train, and if you look, there are even maps of South Carolina showing the number of train lines that were built into these swamp areas, and you can still find some of those evidence of those engines up in the swamps along the Petey and Waccamaw rivers now. There are train engines sitting out there in the swamp rusting away. There are train tracks, cables, old pole systems, just sitting there as evidence of the history that went on up there when it was abandoned. And knowing of the durability of the cypress was even George Washington, when he was building Mount Vernon in 1774, he specified that they would use cypress for the shingles for Mount Vernon. And he had them cut in fan-shaped patterns, and they were painted red to make them look like the expensive red tiles that you could import from Europe. But this was a much cheaper alternative, and it lasted a lot longer. And the original roof lasted for almost 100 years, and after that it was replaced with less durable woods, and it's been replaced several times. But in 1996, when they were renovating Mount Vernon, the architects specified that they would go back to the original. And they found some logs that had been sunk in a swamp in Florida, had them brought up, dried, milled, and the new shingles made. So hopefully the shingles will last for a while in Mount Vernon now. And this is what most of the southeastern swamps looked like by the 1920s. They essentially had cut over the swamps. The loggers knew it was very difficult to get into these areas. They really didn't want to come back. So their goal was to cut out everything that they could and leave. And the landowners and the loggers themselves both recognized at that point in time that the future of the swamps was questionable, because they weren't seeing any regeneration very much. The areas were very wet. They had been altered quite a bit in all the logging activity that went on. So the idea was maybe to just preserve these lands, drain them, use them for the right and useful purpose of agriculture. So a lot of them got converted to agriculture. And by 1925, most of the timber had been cut, followed by the Great Depression. So the majority of the mills closed down at that point in time. But there was some cypress lumbering still occurring and still occurs today, and actually getting to be more prevalent today. Another thing that had a huge impact on the cypress forest, especially here in South Carolina, was the rice culture. In 1762, rice seed were first introduced to South Carolina. And by the 1700s, the state was producing so much rice they couldn't find enough boats to ship it out of Charleston. Georgetown was one of the prime areas of rice production. And the map there shows you Georgetown with the number of plantations along the river system. And they found that when they originally started growing rice in the state, it was more upriver, and some of the little small streams running into the major rivers, like it was done in England, where they would dam up the creek and the river, and they could hold water, and then they could clear the land below it, plant the rice, and then they could flush it with water as they needed it. But as the demand for rice grew, they learned that they could use the power of the tides and the lower portions of the rivers to help them in their flooding of the rice fields. So they cleared all the cypress tupelo swamps along the rivers. Went in and hand dug dikes and put in water control structures, and like I said, it became one of the prime rice growing areas here in the state. And by the 1860s, we had 227 plantations that we know of that existed in the state, covering about 72,000 acres of land. And we know that both the logging and the rice culture had some lasting impacts on our swamps. And the upper picture there is a pull boat pattern shown from the logging. You can see the canal that they dug in, the straight lines, and then the little fan-shaped radials running out from those points. Those were where they pulled the logs into that central collection point, creating along each of those pull runs essentially a little channel that was 4 or 5 feet deep and 6 or 7 feet wide, which allowed the flow of water from the interior of the swamp to flow quicker to the central collection point and then out into the lakes and bays of the surrounding area. So like I said, it changed the hydrology of these systems tremendously in these operations. The other slide is an aerial image of Sandy Island and Waccamaw River, and you can see the old abandoned rice fields that are there. Most of them were abandoned for three reasons. One was the loss of the cheap labor after the Civil War. Another reason was the series of hurricanes in the late 1800s, destroying a lot of the water control structures, and it was just too costly to repair them. And third, there was competition. Texas and Louisiana discovered that with their low, flat coastal lands, it was much cheaper to put in little small dikes with the tractor, and then they could use mechanical means for harvesting the crops. It was much cheaper, and they could do it much faster. And so essentially South Carolina abandoned production of rice at that point in time. But you can see the rice impoundments are still there. Most of them have converted to marshlands. A few have come back as cypress tupelo swamps or shrub swamps, but not, probably only about 25% of them, we estimate, have come back as forest for a number of reasons that we could go into for another lecture. But, so those two activities had a lasting impact on the hydrology of the system. And so now we're up to the present, where this all got started with me in 1973 as a young graduate student moving to Louisiana to go to LSU, never having been in a swamp, never having seen a cypress tree that I knew of, thinking I was going into marine sciences where I got my master's degree, but being sort of asked to look at a swamp system that a proposed pipeline was going to run through for a summer job, which then developed into my master's degree of looking at swamps, and we've never looked back since then. I keep looking ahead. But one of the things that I did, great opportunities that I had when I went to LSU, was that upper picture there, the ball cypress, the tree unique, the wood eternal, by Claire Brown. Claire Brown was just about to retire when I got to LSU, so I was a young man, scared to death going to see this older gentleman because he knew about cypress. He had worked on cypress most of his career in Louisiana, mainly dealing with oil companies, going out looking at the swamps, seeing what impacts they had, aging the trees, just trying to figure out how they were growing and how they were doing. It was a pleasure getting to know him. And in the lower section there's a paper by William Penfound at Tulane University. He was another early pioneer in cypress trees that I got to know the works of quite a bit at that point in time. And we know that, we're talking about ball cypress today, which usually we'll just refer to as cypress, but up in the upper right there you can see an example of the cypress leaves, which is what most people listening today probably have seen and recognize as those nice green little feathery leaflets on each leaf. But we also have here in South Carolina and the southeastern coast is pond cypress over on the left there, which is very similar to ball cypress in its appearance, especially in the bark. But the leaves are more needle-shaped, and they usually point upwards and look like pine needles sticking straight up in the air. But if you take those little needles and you unfurl the leaves, you'll find all those little leaflets like on the ball cypress. They're just all oppressed along the main stem there. And it got its name pond cypress for where it was found, usually growing in isolated wetlands or pond systems. So it got the name pond cypress. And a lot of people, they run across a cypress going around a pond or in a little wetland, they'll just immediately call it pond cypress just because of where it is. But ball cypress can grow in either place without a problem. And then the third type of taxodium that we have is the Montezuma cypress, which is found in Mexico down to Guatemala, mainly growing in upland mountainous areas and little isolated wetlands. But it can grow here in the United States if it's planted, but it just doesn't like water like the other two do. And if you remember from those fossil slides, we talked about fossils being found in Germany and Montana, and in the fossilized trees being found in Hungary and other areas. Taxodium itself at one point in time was very widespread, being found in North America, Europe, Asia, Arctic regions. But today it's mainly, or it is limited to the southeastern United States, being found along river courses and valleys from about Delaware over to Texas and up the Mississippi River Valley to southern Illinois. So that's mainly where you're going to find the taxodium today. And it's where most of our focus has been in our studies. And we've talked about hydrology, and this is one slide that I had an artist at LSU draw for me back in my graduate days, because we wanted to talk to people about these swamps and how hydrology was important and just what the cycle of flooding was in those areas. And in the upper slide you see the low water period, which is usually during the summer, where the water is confined to the main river channels. You've got the back swamp areas where you have some standing water, which can dry out depending upon rainfall and temperatures and how much the trees are transpiring, grading back up into the bottomland hardwoods, which get flooded at times, but are usually drier than the swamps. And then in the bottom part of the slide is the high water periods, and what the normal flooding pattern for most of these rivers is that in springtime with lots of rain, or if you have snow melt upstream, whatever, you have big flood events occurring in the springtime, which would go overtop the natural levees along the river courses, putting water back into the swamps, and at the same time bringing in sediments, which are very important for helping to build and maintain these swamplands, and also bringing in nutrients, bringing in spawning fish, and all kinds of stuff coming into the swamp and helping to flush it out. And then as the water started to recede, we'll get back to the low water period. That water starts moving out of the swamp, carrying with it the young newly spawned fish, the detritus, the organic matter that's fallen from the trees, and has been colonized by microorganisms and becomes a food source for downstream areas, which makes them very important to the estuaries down below them. So that was one of the first questions I was asked in my master's thesis, was how could I study forest getting a marine science degree? And that was the answer that satisfied everybody else. These areas are connected to the downstream areas and are important for the productivity of those systems. So I made it through. Okay, so we know that logging is still occurring in the swamps and is still having an impact. Not so much as in the past, and we are developing methods still to make it less impacted to the swamps. But you can see building roads into the swamps. It can cut off the flow of water from one side of the swamp to the other, impounding water, which means it could stay flooded for long periods of times or permanently. And the use of heavy vehicles is sometimes problematic in these mucky areas, but we do know that it can cause quite a bit of disturbance with the logging. And it is still occurring throughout the southeastern United States. About, 15 years ago, we had quite a to-do with cypress mulch and what impact it was having on our wetlands. In Florida, they were clear-cutting swamps, converting the whole tree, grinding it up into mulch. We started to get a lot of requests in Louisiana and Georgia to harvest swamps to produce mulch. At that point in time, the Louisiana governor called together a special science working group so that we could examine what was going on in the state. And we did have some impact on the sale of cypress mulch in Louisiana. We actually came up with 3 classifications for the swamplands they had. We had swamps that you could harvest and they would come back. We had swamps you could harvest and come back if you planted them. And we had swamps that you could harvest them and they wouldn't come back at all because the water was too deep. So it had some impact on cypress mulch harvesting. But you still see cypress mulch if you go to Walmart or Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever in the springtime. You'll see it piled up there with everything else. It's usually a cypress blend now. And one of the reasons they were promoting cypress mulch was for that rot resistance and durability and the insect resistance of that early wood. But the newly harvested wood is not the old wood. The old wood had time to grow, and after about 100 years, it produces this oil in the central part of the tree that moves out into the sapwood areas. As the older it gets, and gives it that rot resistance durability. The younger trees haven't had time to do that yet, so they're no more rot resistant than anything else. And studies by the Extension Services at Florida showed that you could use it just like any other mulch. It lasts about as long. So there's really not much to promote it in those terms. And then another thing that has become prominent in the last few years is the use of wood pellets and where it comes from. Europe and England decided that their coal mill energy producing plants were being too polluting to the environment, so they wanted to go to something less polluting, so they decided to move to wood pellets. But Europe and England no longer have very many forests because they were all harvested centuries ago. And so they had to go out of the country to get the wood pellets. One of the prime areas is southeastern United States. And the map there shows you plants that are already in operation, planned plants. And you can see Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina are some prime areas that this is occurring in. And the question is that clear cutting of the forest to produce these wood pellets, what impact is it going to have on the long-term future of these forests? And that's a question that we're still bouncing back and forth between the industry and the scientific community, but it is a questionable thing that's happening right now out there. And all these activities are leading to forest fragmentation. And just as an example of this, we'll use the Mississippi River Valley, which originally in the dark green on that left-hand map shows you where the Mississippi River forested wetlands were originally, up to 25 million acres of land. And through time, especially with agriculture in this area, starting with cotton and then soybeans and other crops, we've harvested a tremendous amount of the timber in those areas, as you can see on the right-hand map. The green showing you where the trees still exist, and the cleared lands in the gray. So we're down to about 5 million acres. So we've gone from 25 to 5 million acres just in the Mississippi River Valley. Other things that are having an impact on our forest are navigation activities like deepening of channels. And we're studying Savannah River and Cape Fear rivers where there are active dredging activities going on. And what happens in these areas happened also in like the Mississippi River Gulf outlet on the right bottom and the Houma Navigation Canal with the green freshwater wetlands shown in the upper left there. What happens with all these channels and with the deepening and dredging of these systems is you get saltwater intrusion into the freshwater areas, which has a huge impact on our forested areas and our freshwater marshes. Another thing, especially in Louisiana, would be the oil and gas exploration industry and the dredging of channels and canals to get to the oil and gas fields to get the oil out. Thousands of miles of canals have been dredged, allowing saltwater intrusion into freshwater areas again, changing the hydrology, natural hydrology of the system. Dam construction. There's hardly a river on the Atlantic coast or Gulf Coast that doesn't have a dam on it. And you say, well, what impact does that have? Well, when you put the dam in, you're changing the whole flow pattern of the river. And then also the sediment delivery system of the river. Most of the sediments are now being trapped behind the dam and not getting downstream to these wetlands that need them to help maintain them. And the other thing is you've got that normal low water, high water period that existed. We've changed it. When do we need electricity? A lot of times we need it in the summer for the air conditioning that we all so much desire. So you got to release water, and when you release the water, you're flooding downstream areas, which would normally be dry in that time period. And so you're flooding them, which kills the new seedlings that may have become established, or even, depending on how long it's flooded, may even kill the older mature trees that are there. Again, changes in hydrology. Levee systems and channeling the river, like along the Mississippi River after the 1927 flood that flooded a huge portion of the Mississippi Valley. The Corps of Engineers was given the job of leveeing the river system, putting levees all the way down to the mouth of the river, so all that floodwaters now is funneled directly out of the mouth of the Mississippi River, and all that sediment that was coming downstream is being shunted not into the wetlands, but off the continental shelf. So you've had another impact, no sediment coming in from the Mississippi River flooding, no floodwaters to bring in the sediments and the nutrients and to flush out these systems and maintain them. And in South Louisiana, it's very important because much of South Louisiana was built up by the river flooding as the river switched its course about every 1,000 years, and then when it would switch to a new course, that unconsolidated material then starts to compact and settle, so you have the land subsiding. And then another thing we're talking about in a few minutes is sea level rise. So you got rising water levels and subsiding land, so a lot of southern Louisiana is now flooded for longer and deeper periods than it normally would be. Freshwater withdrawal. How does it impact our wetlands? This is the Google data plant down in Berkeley County. When it was opened, they put in a permit to withdraw water, about 158 million gallons of water per year from the river. And a year later, they would put in an application to triple that withdrawal to 590 million gallons of water per year. So that has a huge impact on the aquifers they're drawing from. They can withdraw so much water that you need to have saltwater intrusion into the aquifer system or up the rivers, since they don't have as much water going down the rivers. So that can have a huge impact on the local hydrology in the forest. Another thing here in South Carolina, looking at Charleston and the proposed development of what we estimate to be the development in the future. You can see in the purple was the original urban Charleston, located at the very central part of that map there, and all the way up to the proposed 2013 in yellow development. And you know, this is not the only place in coastal Louisiana or in other coastal areas. Look at Myrtle Beach, Hilton Head, Beaufort area, or look at Miami. Miami is dry mainly because the pumps pump the water out and keep it dry. And if you've read the newspapers here in the state the last year and a half coming from Charleston, it's almost weekly, you get some kind of press about flooding in Charleston, the number of days, how much it's increased over the years, and how it's moving into these areas. So we're getting a lot of impact from the development that's occurring and with the flooding. But not only man has an impact on what's happening in their swamps. Hurricanes, the southeastern coast has been hit over the years by numerous hurricanes. Probably our most famous one was Hurricane Hugo, which happened a year before I moved here. I came for my job interview here 2 weeks after Hurricane Hugo. You didn't make much of an impression, Georgetown. It was pretty much piled high with debris. But and if you look at impacts just of today, of iota hitting Nicaragua, and the damage that it's doing and what it does in these systems. And even with, if you just look at Georgetown for the last 5 years or so, 6 years or so, starting in 2015, when we had Hurricane Joaquin setting off the coast, dumping up to 2 feet of water in portions of the coast here in the Georgetown area. And then hurricanes in 2016, 17, 18, 19, and then rainfalls this year. Tremendous amount of water being dumped into these systems, or to these coastal systems by the storms. What happens from hurricanes is you don't normally see a cypress tree blown over by a hurricane, mainly because of that knee system that we saw in one of those very first slides. Those knees are spread out from the trees throughout the swamps and mixing with the roots of all the other trees, creating a very stable system. So you don't get very many of them blown over. what normally happens in these swamp systems, damage from the hurricanes, is the stormwater surge, which brings salt water up into these freshwater forests. And because of man's activities with roads and culverts and everything else that's been put in, a lot of times the water gets into the system and it can't get out, causing the death of the trees in the swamp areas. Sea level rise, which we mentioned a little bit in previous slides. This is a slide showing sea level rise in Charleston, South Carolina. You can actually go online and look these up, and it'll give you a modified rate almost every day. Currently, we're about 3.3 millimeters per year, which doesn't sound like much. 3 millimeters is about that much. But think about that in 100 years. That's about a foot. In a lot of these low-lying areas, a foot means a lot. And in future generations, is something they're going to have to deal with. But what's happening, this is a picture of the Sandpit River here in Georgetown. As salt water is intruding into these forested wetland areas, as you're getting the development of what has now been labeled as ghost forest. And if you do a search on Google or anywhere and look at all the ghost forest research and publications and newspaper articles, it's getting a really big play in the press now. So this is happening right here where we are. So, being Mr. Doom and Gloom here, do we actually have any future, or should I retire now? I'll have a chance and rest on my laurels. But we do know that scattered throughout the South, there are old-growth cypress trees still out there. And these are just some pictures of different trees that I've taken pictures of, or pictures I pulled off the internet, especially like the one up in the upper right, which is a big cypress tree in Mexico. And you can see that's a whole class of students stretched around the base of the tree there. That's the largest cypress tree that we know of in the world. So we do know that they're out there, and we do know that many of the areas that were originally logged did come back. Not as much as we had originally, but we did just get some extensive stands come back. And there's quite a bit of lumber out there now. And there is an interest in logging it, whether for mulch or for pellets or for lumber. It's a great wood to work with. I love making toys out of it. It's a very easily worked wood. It has a great look, great grain, great smell. Makes a great interior for walls and for wainscoting, that kind of thing. It's great wood for interior. I wouldn't use it too much outside unless you stain it or protect it some way from the weather. Dr. Dave Staley, a friend of mine, has been studying cypress trees and looking at tree rings of the trees, trying to look at climate patterns that existed, because cypress is an old species. We know that there are several areas with 1,000-year-old or more trees growing in them. He's come up with some wonderful climate chronologies where he's shown that even could be related to things like the original colonies that were established in America that disappeared for some reason. We don't know what happened, but during that time there was a great drought occurred, so that could have had some impact on the colonies or the towns that were established, and people just either died out from the famine or moved in with the Indians to maintain themselves. But one of the things that he's found is a tree growing on the Black River in North Carolina, which he's dated to be 2,624 years old, making it the 5th oldest tree on the earth. And he questions whether or not it might not be the 4th, because where they take the tree core sometimes can be 20 feet high in the tree to get above all the buttress and the swelling and the knots and whatever. So how long did it take the tree to get to that height? So you might add a few more years onto it, which would bring it up closer to the number 4. And he thinks in this area in North Carolina along the Black River that he essentially has convinced the Nature Conservancy to buy and preserve that there may be even some older trees out there. So that's one of his goals. And one of the things that he has done in the last couple of years is to start promoting the idea of the Ancient Ball Cypress Consortium. to try to get people to preserve the areas where these old ancient cypress trees are still growing for future generations, so we can learn from them, from their tree rings as history of the area. So he's working actively on that. Unfortunately, he has not been able to get it funded anywhere, but we are working on it. Another thing that I've been really encouraged by, I was in a workshop last month, Louisiana Coastal Forest Workshop, looking at what's going on in the state of Louisiana in terms of trying to bring together the communities and the researchers and groups to preserve these wetland areas. And one of the things they talked about in one of the talks was the Common Ground Relief Group. They have a goal to plant 1 million trees. And what they're promoting is trying to raise funds for $10. They can grow a seed to a seedling and get it planted in a swamp, so that you can go from the degraded swamp on the left there, plant these areas, and eventually hope we'll have a nice swamp like on the right there. So that's one of the projects that's going on in Louisiana. Another thing, the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana, trying to get volunteers to go out and plant cypress trees in some of these degraded areas. They planted 4,350 trees in 2019. 2019 has been a real challenge for them because it's very difficult to get groups of people in vans to haul them to places, get them in boats, get them out in this COVID restricted area. So, but it is active. They are trying. They are planting areas. And one of the things that happened, we showed originally that slide of Mississippi River Gulf outlet, and it was a source of getting salt water up into freshwater areas. And when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, one of the things it did was it came in right along the path of the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, allowing it to push salt water up into the city of New Orleans and to flood it. So after Hurricane Katrina, one of the things that was decided was they really didn't need the channel for navigation that much, so they closed it off. They put a dam enclosure. You can see the rock dam enclosure on the right there, and also put in a surge barrier in the upper part there to try to keep salt water out. And one of the things that has happened since they've done this is that salinity levels in the Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Maurepas area have declined, and they now estimate that they've got up to 150,000 acres of former cypress swamp land that can be restored. So they have begun planting trees. The Pontchartrain Conservancy has put in about 36,000 trees. The Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana has put in 8,900 trees. So we've got a long way to go. They would like to plant millions of trees. They would like to get this whole area restored to a forest, which helps to protect the city of New Orleans from storm events in the future. So got great hopes for that. Another thing that's going on in the Pointe-aux-Chenes Wildlife Management Area in Louisiana is that they have a goal to restore 4,000 acres of former cypress swamp back to the original swamp conditions by planting 400,000 cypress trees. That would be a great thing to occur. Looking at the map, it looks like a small project, would have a small impact, but in the long run, it could have tremendous benefits to the people and to the wildlife in that area. Closer to home, just right up the road from Georgetown, in Andrews, you've got the Black River Cypress Preserve. Privately funded by the Butler Conservation Funding. They purchased 1,000 acres along the Black River there. They built a very impressive nature trail along the bluff of the swamp there. Canoe and kayak trails, one is called a Piro, that you can go up there. It is open to groups. The main goal of the project is to come up with educational programs to try to bring in these kids from schools in the surrounding area that, even though they live in the area, never visited a swamp, like me, and would know what a cypress tree was if they ran into it. And to do all kinds of educational programs to benefit especially those low-income, hard-hit areas up in the adjacent counties. It's there. like I say, it is open. If you go to their Facebook page, Black River Preserve, on their Facebook page, they'll tell you all about it. They'll tell you how you can get on the property to see what's going on there. It's a beautiful area, and I encourage everyone to visit it. So we do have a future, and through all these years of collecting, and I know my time's running out, so we're going to end up here. It's not me. It's all the people that I've worked with through all these years. Gotten to know some wonderful people and worked with some different organizations and groups that you can't say enough about them. It's them, their support, their inquisitiveness, the students pushing you on. It's just so much that has helped through all these years, and to them a great big thanks I give. And with that, I would open it up to questions if we have any.
I'll start with one if you can hear me okay. You didn't tell us what the knees are for.
Oh, okay, I did. I forgot about that. All right. Originally, they were thought to be pneumatophores or air system to get oxygen to these roots that were flooded with water all the time. But we know from studies that they've conducted looking at gas transport in the knees that they really only bring in enough oxygen to support themselves and not the tree. But going back even into the late 1800s, early 1900s, you can find some publications where scientists were looking at the use of the knees, and what they came up with was that it's a structural feature to help maintain the stability of the tree. And that's usually the most accepted use of the knees. There are studies that show that they do store starch, which may be a food storage area for the tree. Sometimes they may need it. And we've had some whimsical reasons put forth that could have been a means of keeping dinosaurs from getting to the tree to eat the leaves, because you got all these knees and you can't get over there. And my question to the student when he presented that was, how long was the neck of the dinosaur? And how far out do the knees go? But and actually, it's been funny. I've run across that explanation 3 times in my history. So it struck more than one person, but more as a structural feature than anything else.
Okay. A few other questions have come in. You mentioned Johnsonville, South Carolina sand pits. Are you referring to the pits off Lynch's River? Do you know if any trees have been dated from out of there?
It is along the Lynch's River and some of the PD River area there. And we have had, Dave Staley has taken slabs and cores of the trees to look at them. We can't really date them age-wise because they are much older than trees now, so we can't actually link. They can do cross-dating by laying one core over another, and so they can extend it further back in history. But we have got that 40,000-year gap that exists, so we can look at what happened during that time period that they existed, but can't actually put an age on them. So, no, we don't know the exact age of them.
You're optimistic for the future?
Am I optimistic for the future? Yes, I am. We have the trees out there. We have more and more people getting to be aware of these systems. We have more and more people getting out into them. We are educating more students. We're getting younger groups of students out into the swamps and showing them what's going on. And so, I see areas disappearing in the future, but I'm also hoping that I'll see areas coming to be in the future. And so I'm optimistic.
Good. You've encouraged a number of activists who have emailed in referencing the Louisiana projects and ways by which people can contribute to planting trees. Is there any similar projects, for instance, at Hobcall or the Andrews location, where people locally can contribute and support the growth of the forests?
I would love to say yes. That actually has been one of my goals for the last 20 years, to establish something like that. But no, I have not done it. and I don't know of anybody else has done it. At one point, when we first started working at Hopcall, we did raise a lot of cypress seedlings, which we planted out in areas. We donated cypress to some of the plantations on the river to plant in some of their ponded areas. But we thought at that point in time it'd be a great project, even with the Boy Scouts or some other groups that we could grow these seedlings, get these groups and volunteers to go out and plant along the rivers here, these old rice fields. But it's something that we have not developed. That you could probably smack me for that. But I just have not done it. I wish we did.
Well, and maybe this presentation will trigger some others being willing and able to help out and do some projects for the future.
Yeah, that would be great. We're always looking for help.
William, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it so much.
Hopefully you enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And I think what happens is you've shared obviously your mind, your experience, your heart. And that's what's great about our series, is to have people who have such a passion for important subjects to be able to share that with us. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.